Douglas Carrington stood in his Manhattan penthouse, surveying the city below with a look of irritation etched deeply into his face. His assistant had just placed the latest tabloid magazine on his desk, the headline a sensationalized mess. Heiress Victoria Carrington throws $100,000 birthday bash for her dog. The article gleefully chronicled his daughter's recent escapade, complete with photographs of his 25-year-old daughter, Victoria, posing beside her Pomeranian wearing a diamond collar in a private Manhattan club. With an exasperated sigh, Douglas tossed the magazine aside and sank into his leather chair. For years, he had watched his daughter spiral into a life of privilege without purpose, indulgence without meaning. He had tried to instill in her a sense of responsibility, of purpose beyond their wealth. But every lesson had been met with disdain, dismissed by the cavalier attitude of someone who'd never known a day of struggle. To her, life's problems were inconveniences easily solved by money. He heard the soft ding of the elevator and knew Victoria had arrived. As always, she hadn't bothered to call ahead. Douglas watched her enter his office with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dad." She greeted him cheerily, tossing her designer handbag onto the couch as if this were just another casual visit. "Sit down, Victoria," he said, his voice steely. She paused, glancing at him in surprise. She'd never seen her father this cold before. Usually, their arguments ended with him sighing and handing her the proverbial keys to the kingdom. Today, however, something in his expression unsettled her. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously, taking a seat. Douglas took a deep breath, then began. "Victoria, you're squandering the opportunities that I've worked my entire life to create. You're living like the world owes you something, like everyone around you is beneath you. But I'm done watching you throw your life away." She shifted uncomfortably, a smirk forming on her lips. "Oh, here we go. Another lecture about gratitude and hard work, right? This isn't just a lecture." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "You've left me no choice, Victoria. You need a wake-up call, and I know just how to give it to you." Victoria's smirk faded as she registered his tone. "What are you talking about? You want access to your trust fund? You want the Carrington name? You want your lifestyle? Then you're going to prove you deserve it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And I'm going to make sure you experience life without privilege. You'll marry someone who represents everything you don't value: hard work, humility, and resilience. If you do this, you can have your trust fund and your freedom back." Victoria's jaw dropped. "Are you kidding me? You're going to make me marry someone? That's insane." "Not just anyone," he replied, his tone decisive. "His name is Oliver. He's a construction worker on one of our new projects in Brooklyn." "A construction worker?" she gasped, recoiling. "This is some kind of joke, right? You're going to make me marry a nobody to teach me a lesson? That's insane, Dad. I'm not a teenager." "You're right, you're not. You're an adult," he countered, his voice sharp. "But you're an adult who doesn't understand the value of hard work or humility. You'll stay married to him for 1 year. Prove to me that you're capable of building a life outside of all this." He gestured to the wealth around him. "And I'll reinstate your access." Her face flushed with anger. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack," he replied, folding his arms. "This isn't negotiable, Victoria. It's your only option." She stood up, crossing her arms defiantly. "I'll go to court. I'll sue. This is ridiculous. I can't believe you'd humiliate me like this." "You can try," he said, unfazed. "But without my support, you'll find your legal options limited. You might want to consider this carefully before you storm out. If you walk out that door, you're walking out on every last penny." For a moment, they stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Victoria could feel her heart pounding. She had been sure her father would never truly cut her off. He'd always forgiven her, no matter what. But now, looking at his expression, she saw the steely resolve in his eyes. "Fine," she spat. "I'll do it. I'll marry your little construction worker. But don't expect me to like it." Douglas didn't flinch, but something in his gaze softened. "I don't expect you to like it, Victoria, but I do expect you to learn from it." 3 days later, she stood outside a small apartment building in Brooklyn, feeling utterly out of place. She was clad in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, standing in the rough, unfamiliar neighborhood as if she'd been dropped on another planet. She clutched the piece of paper in her hand that held his address and tried to summon the courage to walk up the steps. Inside, she knew, was the man her father had chosen as her punishment. A construction worker. She knew nothing about him except for the fact that he was, as far as she was concerned, the very epitome of everything she'd never wanted. When the door opened, she found herself staring into the eyes of a man about her age, tall, with sandy blonde hair and piercing green eyes. He was muscular, his physique shaped by years of labor rather than gym workouts, and he looked at her with a raised eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Victoria Carrington," he said, as if confirming her identity. His voice was calm, his gaze steady. "I'm Oliver." She felt her stomach twist in humiliation. "So, my dad told you about this arrangement?" she asked, her voice barely hiding her disdain. He nodded. "Yeah, he told me." He shrugged, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "Doesn't mean I'm happy about it." They stood there in silence, both keenly aware of the surreal situation they were in. Victoria, the heiress, and Oliver, the construction worker, forced together as a strange lesson in humility. "Let's just get this over with," she said finally, her voice cold and detached. She couldn't believe she was actually here, speaking to this man she barely knew, her life on the line over her father's ultimatum. Oliver's smirk faded as he took her in, crossing his arms. "Yeah, let's." The chapel was tiny, tucked away in a quiet part of Brooklyn, worlds away from the extravagant venues where Victoria had imagined her wedding would take place. Gone were the glittering chandeliers, the roses flown in from Holland, the string quartet playing softly in the background. Instead, there were plain wooden pews, a small archway decorated with modest flowers, and a crowd that consisted of Oliver's close family and a handful of her father's business associates, most of whom wore expressions of pity. Victoria sat in a cramped dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had chosen a simple white dress, devoid of the intricate lace or pearls she would have once demanded. Her hair was styled into a plain, low bun. Looking at herself, she felt like a stranger. A soft knock sounded at the door. Her father entered, his gaze scanning her carefully. He looked pleased but also somewhat somber, as if he too knew the weight of what he was asking from her. "I came to see if you're ready," he said gently. She stiffened at the sound of his voice, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied bitterly, gripping the bouquet tighter. He sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know you're angry, but I truly hope this experience will teach you something important. Maybe even give you a chance to start fresh." Victoria met his eyes in the mirror, her expression hard. "I understand perfectly, Dad. I'll do what you want, but I'll never forgive you for this." He stepped back, his face etched with regret, but also with a firmness that told her he wouldn't relent. "I suppose that's a risk I'm willing to take." After a few moments, he left, and she was alone again, her mind swirling with resentment and disbelief. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dress, and steadied herself. She would get through this, somehow, and when it was over, she would finally be free. The ceremony itself felt like a dream, surreal and distant. Victoria and Oliver stood at the altar, each unwilling to meet the other's eyes. When the officiant asked them to exchange vows, her voice sounded cold and detached, a stark contrast to the soft, earnest tone in Oliver's voice as he spoke his own promises. "I, Oliver Brooks, take you, Victoria Carrington, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "For better or for worse." Victoria clenched her fists at the words, feeling as though she'd been swallowed up by a strange play, where she had somehow become the star of a story she despised. She managed a forced smile as they exchanged rings, trying to suppress the frustration churning inside her. Finally, the officiant declared them husband and wife, and they faced each other. There was a brief moment of hesitation, a small flash of something almost like sympathy in Oliver's eyes, as if he understood exactly how strange and painful this was for her too. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a polite detachment. "You may now kiss the bride," the officiant announced, his words a cue for a scene Victoria felt utterly unprepared for. Oliver leaned in, placing a chaste, almost mechanical kiss on her cheek. There was no warmth, no affection, only a fleeting contact that felt more like an obligation than a sign of intimacy. Victoria was grateful when he pulled away, giving her space to breathe. As they walked down the aisle, Victoria felt the weight of her new reality settle over her, stifling and claustrophobic. The guests offered polite applause, but she could feel the judgment in their eyes, the whispers that followed her as she passed. She forced herself to keep her head high, refusing to let them see her pain. The small reception was held in a nearby restaurant, where Oliver's family greeted her warmly, though she could sense their wariness. They were kind enough, but she knew they were as baffled by this union as she was. The toast began, and Douglas rose to say a few words. "To my daughter and her husband," he said, lifting his glass. "May this new chapter bring both of you wisdom, growth, and purpose." Victoria clenched her jaw as her father's words sank in. She didn't need wisdom or growth. She needed freedom. Freedom from this man she barely knew, from this life that felt alien and unbearable. As the reception wore on, Oliver approached her, his expression unreadable. "You ready to head home?" Home. The word struck her as odd. The tiny apartment they were about to return to was not her home, not in any way she could recognize. But she nodded, eager to escape the stares and murmurs. The cab ride to Oliver's apartment was silent. The tension between them hung heavy in the air, neither willing to break the silence. Victoria stared out the window, watching the cityscape shift from bright lights and upscale buildings to the more modest surroundings of Brooklyn. When they finally arrived, Oliver paid the driver, and they walked up the steps to his building. Inside, the apartment was neat but cramped, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint scent of fresh paint. She looked around, taking in the small kitchen, the worn-out couch, and the lone bedroom. This was her new reality, a far cry from the opulent Carrington mansion with its sweeping staircases and sprawling gardens. Oliver cleared his throat, breaking her train of thought. "I don't expect you to be thrilled about this. I know it's less than what you're used to." "You don't say," she replied coolly, dropping her designer handbag onto the couch. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Look, I know we're in this together, but I have a life of my own. I'm not here to babysit you. You're free to do what you want, as long as you don't interfere with my routine. Believe me, the last thing I want is to interfere with your life," she shot back. "I'll stay out of your way." He nodded, his expression neutral. "Good. Let's keep it that way." He gestured toward the bedroom. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep on the couch." Victoria's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to this kind of self-sacrifice, especially from someone she barely knew. But she simply shrugged, refusing to acknowledge the small gesture. "Fine by me." With that, he turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her alone in the living room. Victoria took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability as she looked around the cramped space. She felt a pang of humiliation, a sense of being trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, with a man who represented everything she tried to avoid. She made her way to the bedroom, shutting the door behind her and sinking onto the bed. The events of the day weighed on her, and she lay down, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange mix of resentment and confusion that had followed her since she agreed to her father's ultimatum. She didn't know how she would survive a year of this, a year without her comforts, her friends, or her freedom. And as the night deepened, she felt more alone than she ever had before, despite the walls that separated her from the man she now called her husband. Victoria woke to the sounds of a bustling street outside the apartment window, a jarring mix of honking cars, distant shouts, and the steady beat of city life. Her bed was small, the sheets scratchy, and a faint draft crept through the window frame. For a moment, she forgot where she was. But reality settled in quickly, cold and unrelenting. She was in Oliver's apartment, in a life she hadn't chosen. She stepped out of the bedroom, expecting to find him gone, but instead found him in the kitchen, making coffee. He wore jeans and a faded t-shirt, his hair still damp from a shower. He glanced up as she entered, his expression neutral. "Morning," he said, turning back to pour himself a cup. She glanced around the small kitchen, feeling out of place. I didn't realize you'd still be here. I work nights this week, he replied, taking a sip of his coffee. You're on your own today. If you need groceries, the list is on the fridge. Victoria couldn't help but bristle at his calm demeanor. Here he was, acting as if this was all perfectly normal, as if he hadn't just married a stranger at her father's insistence. You don't need to worry about me, she replied stiffly. I'll manage. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Fine, just don't get lost. She didn't bother replying and instead slipped into the bathroom, determined to get through the day with as little interaction with Oliver as possible. The bathroom was tiny, and when she turned on the faucet, only lukewarm water came out. She missed the steaming, spa-like showers of her father's mansion and felt a fresh wave of resentment. Once she was ready, she dressed in her simplest clothes, a pair of jeans and a sweater, both of which felt foreign to her, like a costume for a role she didn't want to play. She grabbed her purse and left the apartment, eager to escape the confinement of her new reality. For the first few hours, she wandered aimlessly, walking through the narrow streets of Brooklyn. Everything around her was alien. Small mom-and-pop shops, a laundromat with an old neon sign flickering above it, a market with fresh produce spilling out onto the sidewalk. The people she passed barely glanced her way, focused on their own lives, their own errands. Eventually, she found herself near a community center, where a group of volunteers was setting up tables and unloading boxes. Curious, she lingered on the sidewalk, watching as they arranged canned goods and produce. A tall woman with warm brown eyes and a clipboard noticed her standing nearby and approached. Hi there. Are you interested in volunteering? The woman asked with a smile. Victoria blinked, caught off guard. Volunteering? The thought had never crossed her mind. She hesitated, but something about the woman's friendly demeanor made her pause. I don't know, she replied. I'm not sure if I'm suited for this. The woman chuckled. There's no suit required for helping out. I'm Angela, by the way. We're just setting up a food drive to help local families. Angela's warmth was infectious, and against her instincts, Victoria found herself nodding. All right, I guess I could help. Great. Here, you can help us sort these. Angela handed her a box of canned goods, and Victoria followed her over to a table where others were sorting food. She felt a strange mix of awkwardness and curiosity. She had never done anything like this before. Her charity work had always involved signing checks, attending galas, and posing for photos, not packing food into bags for people in need. As she worked, she listened to the volunteers around her, most of whom had lived in the neighborhood for years. They shared stories of community events, local gossip, and even joked about the weather. It felt strangely real, the kind of ordinary, everyday life she'd never been part of. When they finished, Angela handed her a sandwich and a bottle of water. Thanks for the help. You didn't have to do this, you know? Victoria took the sandwich, surprised by the gratitude in Angela's eyes. It was different, but nice, she admitted, feeling a bit of warmth bloom inside her chest. Angela gave her a knowing smile. Well, we can always use more hands. You're welcome back anytime. That evening, Victoria returned to the apartment feeling strangely accomplished. For the first time in years, she'd done something that wasn't for show. She'd helped real people, and it felt satisfying. When she walked in, Oliver was on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up, his eyebrows raised in surprise. You're back early. I didn't realize there was a curfew, she shot back, unable to resist her usual edge. But when he looked unamused, she sighed. I was at the community center, helping with a food drive. His expression softened, and she noticed a flicker of surprise. Community service, huh? Didn't peg you as the type. She felt her face flush with irritation, but instead of snapping, she replied calmly, I didn't do it for anyone's approval, least of all yours. He shrugged, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Good. I wouldn't waste time trying to impress me. For a moment, they stood in silence, each holding their ground. But then, in a surprising move, he offered her the takeout container he had beside him. Pizza? She hesitated, thrown off by the small gesture of kindness. But hunger won, and she took the container, sitting down on the far end of the couch. They ate in silence, both staring at the TV where a muted sports game was playing. As she ate, Victoria couldn't help but steal glances at him. She had expected Oliver to be bitter, to resent her presence as much as she resented his. But he seemed almost indifferent, as if he had nothing to prove and nothing to gain. That, she realized, was what made him so unnerving. Unlike everyone else in her life, Oliver didn't see her as someone to impress or manipulate. He treated her like an equal, whether she liked it or not. After a few moments, he spoke, his tone surprisingly neutral. "I know this isn't easy for you, but it's not exactly easy for me either." She raised an eyebrow. "Then why agree to it?" He looked down, toying with his pizza crust. "Your father and I had an arrangement. Let's just say he made it worth my while." "So it's about money," she muttered, feeling a flicker of disappointment. "Money, sure," he said, meeting her gaze with a blunt honesty that took her aback. "But it's also about making something of myself. This place," he gestured around the small apartment, "it's temporary. I'm saving up to start my own construction company." The admission surprised her. She had assumed Oliver was content with his modest life, that he lacked ambition. But here he was, talking about building something for himself. The realization left her feeling strangely unsettled. "Well, I'm glad one of us is getting something out of this," she replied, her tone softer than she intended. They finished their meal in silence, and for the first time since she arrived, Victoria felt a sliver of understanding between them. Perhaps Oliver wasn't the simple, one-dimensional man she'd pegged him as. There was more to him than met the eye, and that both intrigued and unsettled her. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Victoria began to adapt to her new life. She spent more time at the community center, growing comfortable with the routines and the people there. Angela became a friend, someone who didn't care about Victoria's past or her family name. Her days were filled with small, purposeful tasks, sorting food, organizing events, helping out wherever she could. And for the first time in years, she felt a genuine sense of purpose. Oliver, meanwhile, remained a steady presence. He was reserved, keeping mostly to himself, but he never interfered with her newfound activities. They maintained a cordial distance, acknowledging each other with nods and brief exchanges, but never prying too deeply. But one evening, as they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, something shifted. Oliver looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "You've changed," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Since you got here," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're not the same person who walked into this apartment." She felt her heart skip at his words, the weight of his observation settling over her. In the quiet of that moment, she realized he was right. She had changed. Her world had changed, and there was no going back. For the first time, Victoria felt the beginning of something that had been missing for so long. The soft glow of the morning sun filled the tiny kitchen as Victoria poured herself a cup of coffee. She had fallen into a comfortable rhythm over the past few weeks, a life shaped by simpler routines and unexpected connections. The community center had become her sanctuary, a place where her name, her background, and her past didn't matter. Today, she planned to help Angela and the other volunteers set up a fundraiser for the center. The project had become something of a personal mission for her, and she found herself drawn to the challenge of raising donations, of convincing local businesses to support their cause. It was strange but gratifying to watch as her actions yielded tangible results, as her efforts filled the empty shelves of the pantry and funded after-school programs for neighborhood kids. She had never felt this way in her old life. As she finished her coffee, she heard Oliver in the living room, his voice low as he spoke on the phone. She couldn't help but listen as he discussed building permits and bids for a new project he was working on. She was surprised to realize that he sounded driven. He was someone who didn't just talk about his ambitions. He was making them happen. When he hung up, she leaned against the kitchen counter, unable to keep herself from asking, "Is this project part of the business you're starting?" He glanced up, slightly surprised. "Yeah, just working out the details." "It sounds like a lot of work," she said, genuinely curious. "I didn't realize. I didn't expect you to be so serious about it." He shrugged, giving her a measured look. "Guess I'm not the only one surprising people around here," he said with a faint smirk. She rolled her eyes, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. Fair enough. As she turned to leave, he spoke up again. You know, I've been thinking about stopping by the fundraiser tonight. I'm curious to see what you've been putting all your time into. She blinked, taken aback. You want to come? Why not? He replied, his gaze steady. It sounds like a good cause. For a moment, they held each other's gaze, an unspoken understanding passing between them. She nodded. All right. See you there. That evening, Victoria arrived at the community center early to help with the setup. She felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as she arranged tables, strung up lights, and placed donation boxes by the entrance. She was fully invested in the outcome of this event. The funds raised tonight would determine whether the center could keep its doors open to the families who relied on it. Angela came over and placed a hand on her shoulder. You've done an amazing job, Victoria. None of this would have been possible without you. Victoria felt a surge of pride and a rare sense of belonging. Thanks, Angela. I'm just glad to help. As guests began to trickle in, she busied herself greeting people, guiding them to the tables, and explaining the importance of the center's work. To her surprise, her father's network came in handy. She had reached out to a few of his connections, some of whom had generously offered donations. The atmosphere grew lively, with music playing softly and people mingling, laughing, and enjoying the catered food and drinks. For once, Victoria felt that her presence wasn't just for show. She was there because she wanted to be, because this work mattered to her. As she was explaining the purpose of the fundraiser to a local business owner, she saw Oliver enter the room. He wore a simple but neatly pressed shirt, his expression reserved but attentive as he took in the event. She finished her conversation and made her way over to him, surprised by the small flutter of nerves she felt. You actually came, she said, her voice filled with a hint of surprise. He gave her a small nod, a faint smile on his lips. Told you I would. Looks like you've done a great job. Thanks, she replied, feeling a strange warmth at his words. It's been a lot of work, but it feels good to be part of something real. He looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. You know, when I first met you, I never would have guessed you had this in you. She met his eyes, hearing the sincerity in his voice. Neither did I. For the next hour, they moved around the room together, helping with various tasks, meeting guests, and guiding people to the donation tables. Victoria noticed the curious glances of some of the volunteers as they watched her interact with Oliver. She wasn't sure what they thought of him, but she sensed their approval in the way they smiled and nodded whenever she introduced him as her husband. At one point, as they were restocking supplies at a refreshment table, Angela came over, a knowing smile on her face. So, Oliver, she said, her tone warm and playful. It's good to finally meet the man Victoria's told us so much about. Oliver raised an eyebrow at Victoria, amused. I wasn't aware I was such a popular topic. Victoria felt herself flush, but she managed a calm smile. Well, now you know. Angela laughed, patting Victoria on the arm. You two make a good team. As Angela walked away, Victoria turned to Oliver, a slight smirk on her face. She's just being polite. He shrugged, giving her a sidelong glance. Maybe, but I don't think she's wrong. The evening continued, and as the event wound down, the donation boxes filled with envelopes and cash, each contribution a symbol of the community's support. Victoria felt a swell of pride as she looked at the totals. They had raised enough to secure the center's operations for at least another year. After the last guest had left, Angela gathered the volunteers and announced the total. Everyone broke into applause, congratulating one another. Victoria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, touched by the shared joy and the sense of accomplishment. She looked over at Oliver, who gave her a nod of approval. Looks like you really did it, he said softly. Thanks for being here, she replied, her voice filled with emotion. It means a lot. He shrugged, his expression softened. I wouldn't have missed it. As they walked home that night, an easy silence fell between them. The streets were quieter now, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Victoria felt a sense of peace that was unfamiliar, a quiet satisfaction that resonated deeply within her. They reached the apartment building, and as they climbed the stairs, She felt the impulse to say something, to acknowledge the shift in their relationship. But as she turned to him, searching for the right words, she hesitated. She wasn't sure if he felt the same way, or if he even saw her in a different light. When they reached their door, Oliver paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have to admit, I'm impressed," he said, his voice low. "I never thought you'd find yourself here, doing something like this." She managed a soft smile, her heart pounding. "Neither did I." They stood in silence, each grappling with the unexpected connection that had grown between them. It was a strange and delicate thing, born of proximity and shared experiences, yet rooted in something deeper. It was as if they'd crossed an invisible line, each finding a version of the other they hadn't expected. Finally, Oliver broke the silence. "Good night, Victoria." "Good night," she replied, feeling a strange ache as he turned and walked toward the couch. She watched him settle in, feeling a longing she couldn't quite name. As she lay in bed that night, she stared up at the ceiling, her mind whirling. Somewhere along the way, her resentment had softened, replaced by a curiosity and a quiet admiration for the man she had once viewed as her punishment. He had become a steady, unwavering presence in her life, and she realized that his kindness, his unpretentious strength, had changed her more than she'd ever thought possible. The next morning, Victoria awoke early, a sense of resolve building in her chest. She wanted to do something for Oliver, something that would show him she appreciated his support. She remembered how he'd mentioned his goal of starting his own business, and a plan began to form in her mind. She spent the day researching small business grants, contacting local networks, and even pulling a few strings with people she knew. By evening, she had gathered a wealth of resources for him, a list of opportunities that could help him take his first steps toward independence. When Oliver came home that night, tired but visibly pleased after a long day, she set the stack of information on the kitchen table. "This is for you," she said, her voice soft but earnest. He looked at the stack, surprised. "What's this?" It's some resources," she said, feeling uncharacteristically shy, "to help you get started with your business." He stared at her, his eyes widening with surprise. "You did this for me?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "I know how much it means to you, and I want you to have a chance at making it real." For a long moment, he just looked at her, and she saw something shift in his gaze, something warmer, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen. "Thank you, Victoria. I mean it." Their eyes met, and in that moment, she knew that everything had changed. The resentment, the walls, the distance between them. All of it had begun to fade, replaced by something real, something that felt frightening and exhilarating all at once. And as she stood there, her heart racing, she realized that she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The days that followed were marked by an unexpected ease between Victoria and Oliver, a quiet sense of camaraderie that neither could have predicted when they first met. Gone was the hostility, replaced by an unspoken understanding, a tentative trust that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Their shared apartment, once a symbol of her humiliation, had become a haven, a space filled with the rhythm of their unpretentious, real lives. One morning, as she prepared breakfast, Victoria glanced at Oliver sitting at the table, poring over the materials she'd gathered for his business. She felt a sense of pride watching him, knowing she had played a part in helping him take his first steps toward his dream. The satisfaction was something she hadn't felt before, and it was stirring her in unexpected ways. "Any progress with those grants?" she asked, placing a plate of toast in front of him. He looked up, a smile tugging at his lips. "Actually, yeah. A few of these grants look promising, and I'm putting together my business plan." He paused, studying her with an unreadable expression. "I still can't believe you did this for me. I didn't think you'd care." Victoria hesitated, feeling strangely vulnerable. "It's the least I could do. You've been supportive. This is just my way of returning the favor." A comfortable silence stretched between them as they ate, and for the first time, she found herself enjoying the simplicity of it all. They didn't need elaborate plans or social events. Here, it was just them, two people who had been thrown together, finding common ground in the most surprising ways. Later that day, Victoria headed to the community center, her sanctuary and escape. Today, she was overseeing an after-school program for neighborhood kids, and she couldn't help but feel a warm glow of pride as they ran up to her, calling her name and eagerly sharing stories about their day. She had come to know many of them by name, their dreams, and even their fears. It was a far cry from the life she'd once known, and yet, she couldn't imagine going back. "Victoria, you look different today," Angela commented as they organized art supplies for the kids. "I'd say happier. More at peace." Victoria laughed softly. "I suppose I am." Angela's knowing gaze lingered on her, a smile spreading across her face. "And Oliver? How are things with him?" Victoria felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "We've grown closer," she admitted. "I think I misjudged him. He's ambitious, thoughtful. He's nothing like I expected." Angela nodded, her smile widening. "I told you he was a good man. Sometimes it takes time to see past the surface." As Victoria watched the children paint, her mind wandered back to Oliver. He had become a constant in her life, a steady presence that she had come to appreciate, even rely on. The walls she had carefully constructed around herself were crumbling, and in their place was a feeling she couldn't quite name but had begun to cherish. When Victoria returned to the apartment that evening, Oliver was cooking dinner. The air was filled with the aroma of pasta and fresh garlic, and the sight of him standing in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and focused on his task, brought a smile to her face. "You're cooking?" she asked, setting her bag down and walking over to the stove. He glanced at her with a grin. "Don't look so surprised. I figured I owed you dinner after all the breakfasts you've made." She leaned against the counter, watching as he stirred the sauce. "I never thought I'd say this, but I actually enjoy cooking. It's calming." He chuckled, giving the sauce a quick taste. "And who would have guessed you'd be calming down in my cramped kitchen in Brooklyn?" She laughed, feeling an unexpected warmth bloom inside her. "Certainly not me." They set the table together, and as they ate, their conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from his business plans to her latest ideas for the community center. It felt easy, natural, like they were two old friends catching up rather than two strangers bound by a forced marriage. When they finished, they moved to the couch, and Victoria felt a small, happy flutter as they sat side by side, a comforting silence settling over them. She looked at Oliver, noticing for the first time the way his features softened when he smiled, the glint of determination in his eyes. He was nothing like the men she'd known before. There was a strength in him, a quiet confidence that drew her in. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Just how unexpected this is." He raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing on his lips. "This?" She nodded, feeling her cheeks warm. "You, me, this life. I never imagined it would feel like this." Oliver studied her, his gaze intense. "Me neither. I agreed to this arrangement because I thought it would help my future. But now, I don't know. It's becoming more than that." They held each other's gaze, the unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Her pulse quickened, her heart pounding as she felt herself drawn to him. The walls she had so carefully guarded seemed to vanish, leaving her bare and vulnerable. Before she could second-guess herself, she reached out, her hand brushing his. For a moment, he froze, his eyes widening in surprise. But then, he intertwined his fingers with hers, his touch warm and steady. They sat in silence, each lost in the quiet intensity of the moment, their connection stronger and deeper than words could express. As the days passed, their bond only grew. Victoria found herself opening up to Oliver, sharing stories of her childhood, her dreams, her fears. He listened intently, his quiet presence soothing her, and she felt a freedom she hadn't experienced before. It was as if he saw her, the real her, not the polished facade she had worn for so long. One evening, Father's actions, however misguided, had stemmed from a desire to see her succeed. Though she would never fully forgive the ways he had tried to manipulate her, she could at least accept his flaws and see him not as a force to resist, but as a father who, despite his faults, had always loved her in his own way. Back at home, Oliver's construction company was growing, slowly but surely. With Victoria's help, He had landed a series of contracts that allowed him to hire his first team of employees. His small company was evolving into a reputable business, and his dream of building an independent life was becoming a reality. One evening, as they celebrated another successful contract over takeout and wine in their apartment, Oliver surprised her with a proposal. Not a proposal of marriage, but a partnership. "Victoria, you know I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, his voice earnest. "I don't just want you as my wife. I want you as my partner. I want you to be part of this company, officially. We've built this together, and I want our names to stand side by side." Victoria looked at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Are you sure? I know how much this business means to you, and I don't want to intrude." He took her hand, his gaze filled with certainty. "You're not intruding. You're as much a part of this as I am. We're a team, Victoria, in everything we do. I can't imagine doing this without you." Tears pricked at her eyes as she nodded, squeezing his hand. "Then yes, Oliver. I'd be honored." They sealed the partnership with a kiss, a promise of the life they were building together. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. It was a partnership rooted in love, trust, and a shared purpose that had grown from the soil of hardship and sacrifice. The partnership brought a new level of joy and fulfillment to their lives. They spent countless late nights at the dining table, planning projects, drafting budgets, and envisioning the future of their business. Every step felt like a small victory, a shared achievement that drew them closer together. Their dynamic as business partners was different from their dynamic as husband and wife. In the office, they each had their own strengths. Victoria was the strategist, the organizer, while Oliver was the visionary, the hands-on leader who brought their plans to life. They balanced each other, each complementing the other's skills in a way that made their business thrive. Working together brought challenges, too. They clashed over budget decisions, struggled with time management, and sometimes found themselves overwhelmed by the pressure of running a business while balancing their roles at the community center. But each challenge they faced strengthened their bond, teaching them to communicate openly and to rely on each other in new and profound ways. One afternoon, after a particularly intense meeting with a client, Victoria returned to the community center, where she found her father working in the daycare. He was reading a story to a group of toddlers, his voice animated as he held up a picture book, much to their delight. She watched from the doorway, a soft smile on her face. Seeing her father like this, a man who had once been defined by power and wealth, now quietly engaging with children in a daycare, was both surprising and heartwarming. She realized that he, too, had changed, that his involvement in the center had softened him in ways she hadn't expected. When the story ended, he looked up and saw her, his expression lightening. "Ah, there you are," he said, rising to greet her. "These kids have quite the energy." She laughed, stepping forward to join him. "They do keep us on our toes, don't they?" Douglas looked at her, a trace of pride in his eyes. "I have to say, I never imagined I'd find myself in a daycare at this stage of my life. But it's strangely fulfilling." Victoria felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace settling over her heart. "It suits you, Dad, and I'm glad you're here." He smiled, a hint of emotion in his gaze. "So am I, Victoria. So am I." As the months passed, Victoria and Oliver continued to expand their lives in new and meaningful ways. The community center thrived, with new programs, classes, and events that served the ever-growing needs of the neighborhood. Oliver's business grew as well, and together they managed to secure contracts that allowed them to hire more employees and take on larger projects. But beyond their professional success, it was the personal growth that marked the real change. They had transformed, not just as individuals, but as a couple. They had learned the true meaning of partnership, of sacrifice and understanding, of trust and resilience. They had built a life that was as rich in love as it was in purpose, a life rooted in the things that truly mattered. One evening, as they sat on the rooftop of their apartment building, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky, Victoria leaned her head on Oliver's shoulder, a contented smile on her face. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "Every day, and I wouldn't change a single thing." She looked up at him, her heart brimming with gratitude. Neither would I. They sat in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, each lost in the beauty of the life they had created. The road to this moment had been anything but easy. They had faced betrayal, pain, and hardship, but through it all, they had found each other, found love, and built a life that was more real, more fulfilling than anything they had ever known. And as they sat there, wrapped in the quiet warmth of each other's presence, they knew that they had finally found their true home in each other. Life settled into a satisfying rhythm as Victoria and Oliver built their shared empire. Their days were filled with work, their evenings spent planning for the future, and their weekends dedicated to the community center and to each other. The modest Brooklyn apartment, once a symbol of a forced marriage, had become their sanctuary, a place where they could leave behind the pressures of business and simply be themselves. The community center flourished under Victoria's leadership, and her father's involvement, though reserved, continued to grow. The daycare program had transformed the lives of countless families, and new initiatives were constantly in the works, from after-school tutoring to job training for young adults. Victoria felt a deep sense of pride in the impact they were making, and her relationship with Douglas, once fractured, was slowly healing with every small, meaningful gesture. One afternoon, as Victoria was reviewing the upcoming budget for the center, Douglas entered her office, his expression thoughtful. "Victoria," he began, his voice hesitant, "I have something I want to discuss with you. It's important." She set down her papers, intrigued by the gravity in his tone. "Of course, Dad. What's on your mind?" He took a seat across from her, his gaze steady but filled with a vulnerability she rarely saw. "I've been thinking about my legacy, about everything I've built, and about what I want to leave behind. And I've realized that it's time for me to step back from the business." Victoria's eyes widened in surprise. She'd never imagined her father would willingly let go of his empire. His identity had always been bound up in his achievements, his power, his control over the Carrington fortune. "Dad," she said softly, "are you sure? This is huge." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm certain, Victoria. I've spent my life building that business, but I've come to realize that there are more important things. I want to spend my remaining years doing something meaningful, something real, like what you've done here." She felt a swell of emotion, touched by his words. "What are you saying, Dad?" He took a deep breath, looking her in the eye. "I'd like to turn over a significant portion of the family's assets to fund the expansion of the community center and similar programs in cities across the country. I want to invest in something that gives back, something that stands for more than just profit. And I want you and Oliver to lead it." Victoria's heart leapt at the idea. She dreamed of expanding their impact, of reaching more communities and helping those in need on a larger scale. And to have her father entrust her with such a monumental task felt like a profound gesture of faith, a true acknowledgement of her purpose. "Dad, I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is more than I ever imagined." Douglas reached across the table, taking her hand. "You don't have to say anything, Victoria. I'm proud of you, and I want to support your vision. I know I haven't always shown it, but I see now that you're exactly where you're meant to be. This is your legacy, not mine." For a long moment, they sat in silence, each processing the magnitude of the decision. Victoria felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet certainty that she was ready for this new responsibility. She had found her place in the world, and with her father's support, she could make a difference that extended far beyond what she'd ever thought possible. That evening, she shared the news with Oliver over dinner. His face lit up with excitement, and he took her hands, his gaze filled with admiration. "Victoria, this is incredible. You're going to change so many lives," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "We're going to change lives," she corrected, smiling. "I want you by my side for this. We're in this together, remember?" He chuckled, nodding. "Always." They spent the rest of the evening discussing their plans, brainstorming ideas for the expansion and envisioning what the future could hold. They talked late into the night, sketching out rough outlines of the programs they wanted to implement and dreaming of the impact they could make in underserved communities. It was the kind of work that filled them both with purpose, and they knew that together they could accomplish anything. As the months passed, Victoria and Oliver took on the challenge of expanding the center's mission, building partnerships with other community organizations, and securing resources to launch new programs. They traveled to cities across the country, meeting with local leaders, gathering insights, and shaping their vision into something tangible. Each visit deepened their understanding of the unique needs of each community, and they adapted their approach, committed to creating programs that would resonate on a local level. Their bond grew stronger with each step, and their teamwork became a seamless dance of mutual respect and shared ambition. Victoria's strategic thinking and Oliver's hands-on expertise proved to be a powerful combination, and they navigated every challenge with a united front. Together, they were unstoppable. One evening, during a rare night off, they found themselves back at the rooftop of their Brooklyn apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The cool night air filled with the hum of distant traffic, and they stood side by side, their hands intertwined, each lost in their thoughts. Oliver glanced at her, his expression contemplative. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if things had gone according to plan?" Victoria laughed softly, shaking her head. "I used to, but now, I'm just grateful that it didn't. This life, everything we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed." He turned to her, his eyes filled with warmth. "I wouldn't trade it for anything, Victoria. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, and I'm even prouder of the person you've become." She felt a surge of emotion, her heart swelling as she looked at him. "You're part of that, Oliver. You showed me what real partnership means. You helped me see that love is more than just a feeling. It's a choice, something you build and nurture every day." He pulled her close, his voice a soft whisper. "And I'll choose you every day, for the rest of my life." They stood together, wrapped in each other's arms, feeling the depth of their connection and the promise of the future they were building together. Their journey had been marked by challenges, by pain and betrayal, but it had also been filled with growth, resilience, and an enduring love that had carried them through it all. In the following months, their organization launched new centers in cities across the country, each one tailored to the needs of the local community. They created programs focused on education, vocational training, mental health support, and financial literacy, addressing the root causes of poverty and providing individuals with the tools they needed to thrive. Victoria's relationship with her father deepened, evolving into a true partnership as they worked together to bring her vision to life. Douglas had stepped back from his role in the business world, dedicating his time and resources to the new foundation they had established together. He attended events, spoke at fundraisers, and took an active role in the mission he had once struggled to understand. His pride in his daughter was evident in every word, and their once complicated bond was transformed into something profound and lasting. Victoria and Oliver became well known in their community, beloved for their commitment to creating real change. They had turned their lives into a story of resilience, of finding purpose in the face of adversity, and of choosing love over comfort and partnership over power. They were no longer just business partners or even a married couple. They were a beacon of hope, a testament to the strength that came from building something together. One evening, at a gala celebrating the one-year anniversary of their expanded organization, Victoria stood on stage, addressing a room filled with supporters, volunteers, and families whose lives had been touched by their work. She looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. "This foundation began as a dream," she said, her voice steady. "A dream to create a place where everyone, regardless of their background, could find the support they needed to build a better future. Today, that dream has grown beyond anything I ever imagined. But none of this would have been possible without the people who believed in this vision and the man who has stood by my side every step of the way." She looked at Oliver, who stood at the side of the stage, watching her with a smile of pure admiration. Their eyes met, and she felt the connection between them, a bond forged through trials and triumphs, and strengthened by the love they had fought so hard to protect. "To everyone here tonight," she continued, "thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we're building a legacy that will continue to grow, to serve, and to uplift. And I am honored to be part of this with all of you." The crowd erupted into applause, and as she stepped off the stage, Oliver wrapped her in a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "And I'm proud of us. Look at what we've built, Oliver. It's everything I ever wanted." They stood together, surrounded by friends and family, their love a testament to the power of resilience, forgiveness, and partnership. They had built a life that was rich in purpose and grounded in the values they held dear, and they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As they walked out of the gala hand in hand, the future stretched before them, a bright and beautiful tapestry of possibility, woven from the choices they had made and the love they had fought to preserve. Years passed, and Victoria and Oliver's lives continued to flourish. Their foundation became a force for good, impacting lives across the country and bringing about lasting change in struggling communities. The organization grew to include educational scholarships, business grants for budding entrepreneurs, and mental health support programs. Each new initiative carried a piece of Victoria and Oliver's hearts, a reflection of the journey that had led them to this place. Their Brooklyn apartment, once a modest residence, became a cherished home filled with memories. They made it a space that honored their story, a story that had started as a forced marriage and blossomed into an unbreakable partnership defined by love and purpose. One evening, as they prepared for yet another gala to support their latest initiative, Oliver found himself gazing at Victoria as she adjusted a pendant around her neck, a small silver feather he'd bought her at that first festival so long ago. She caught his gaze in the mirror and raised an eyebrow, smiling. "What?" she asked, her tone playful. He walked over, placing his hands on her shoulders and meeting her eyes in the mirror. I'm grateful for every twist of fate that brought us here," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "We never would have guessed back then where we'd end up." She reached up, covering his hand with hers. "I wouldn't change a thing." They stood in a comfortable silence, each of them marveling at the life they'd created. Their journey hadn't been easy, but the struggles had only deepened their love, shaping them into the people they were today. As they arrived at the gala, they were greeted by applause and warm smiles. The crowd was filled with supporters and volunteers, people whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's work. Among the guests were parents who had secured jobs through their vocational training programs, students who had received scholarships, and even local leaders who'd worked closely with them to create change in their communities. Victoria took the stage to make her speech, glancing briefly at Oliver, who gave her an encouraging nod. She smiled, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. Addressing the crowd, she felt the enormity of the legacy they were creating. "When we started this foundation, Oliver and I had a dream," she began, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "A dream to create spaces where people could access the resources, support, and encouragement they needed to build brighter futures. Tonight, as I look out at all of you, I see that dream alive and thriving." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, catching sight of her father, who stood in the front row, his face beaming with pride. Victoria's relationship with him had transformed over the years. The walls of control and judgment that had once divided them had been replaced by respect and love. Douglas had become an integral part of their mission, and in his later years, he'd found a new purpose supporting the foundation's work. She continued, her voice filled with emotion. "This foundation wouldn't exist without the love, hard work, and sacrifice of so many people. And as I stand here today, I want to remind each of you that this legacy belongs to all of us. Together, we are changing lives, creating opportunities, and building a future that we can all be proud of." The room erupted in applause, and as she stepped off the stage, Oliver met her, pulling her into an embrace. "That was beautiful, Victoria," he murmured, his voice filled with admiration. "You have no idea how proud I am of you." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And I'm proud of us. None of this would have happened without you." As the night continued, they mingled with the guests, sharing stories, laughter, and memories. Victoria felt a profound sense of contentment. She had found her purpose, built a life of meaning and impact, and discovered a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. As the gala wound down, Douglas approached them, his face softened by the years and the quiet fulfillment of his later work. "Victoria, Oliver," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I want you both to know how proud I am of everything you've accomplished. You've created something I could only dream of. I may have been the one who set this whole thing in motion, but you're the ones who made it into something lasting." Victoria hugged him tightly, feeling a surge of affection and gratitude for the man who had, in his own way, brought her to this place. "Thank you, Dad, for everything. I wouldn't be here without you." Douglas nodded, his eyes misty. "No, sweetheart. You did this on your own. I just gave you the nudge." They shared a tender smile, and as he moved to greet the other guests, Victoria felt a sense of closure. The doubts and misunderstandings that had once marred their relationship had given way to something enduring, a bond built on understanding and mutual respect. She had finally come to accept him, flaws and all, and he, in turn, had learned to honor her path. Later that night, Victoria and Oliver returned to their apartment, their hearts full from the night celebrations. They changed into their pajamas, each settling into the familiar comfort of their small but cozy living room. Oliver pulled out a worn box, the one where they kept mementos from their journey together, a ticket stub from the festival where he'd bought her the feather bracelet, notes they'd exchanged during the early days of their marriage, photos from their first shared projects at the community center. As they sifted through the memories, Victoria felt the fullness of everything they'd created together. Their love, their life, and their legacy were all woven from the quiet, steady moments they'd shared. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Oliver asked, his voice filled with awe. She smiled, threading her fingers through his. "I never imagined this back then, but now, I can't imagine my life without it." They sat together in comfortable silence, content in the knowledge that they had built a life not just of success, but of meaning. They had turned hardship into strength, pain into purpose, and through it all, they had found each other. Years later, when they looked back on their lives, Victoria and Oliver could see that the legacy they had created was so much more than buildings or programs. It was a legacy of love, resilience, and purpose that had touched countless lives. They watched as the next generation took up the work they had started, inspired by the passion and dedication that had defined their own journey. The community center, now a bustling hub of activity, stood as a testament to their love story, a story that had started with doubt and distrust and blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. And as they sat on a park bench one evening, watching children play and families gather, they felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "We did it, didn't we?" Victoria murmured, her voice soft with wonder. Oliver took her hand, his gaze filled with the love that had only deepened over the years. "Yes, we did. And we did it together." Their hands remained intertwined, each holding a lifetime of memories, dreams, and a legacy that would live on long after they were gone. They had built a life that mattered, a life that was rich in love and purpose. And as they sat together, basking in the quiet joy of their shared journey, they knew that they had truly found their forever home, in each other and in the lives they had touched.